We're all set up, and we need a photograph already. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to hand over to you, Paul, and you're going to surprise us all, I'm sure, with some of your insights about what's happening right now.
Well, thank you very much, Joan, and thank you to the Economist for the invitation, and the speakers for enlightening us, and the sponsors. Really delighted to be here. As someone who's been traveling to Greece every few years for 4 decades, I'm often asked by people in Washington to explain the politics of my ancestral homeland. All 4 of my grandparents came from Greece. They would see the instability in Greece, the radical left government trying to overthrow the international financial order, while neo-Nazi parties won seats in parliament, and they would ask, what the heck is going on in Greece? Today, the situation is remarkably different. That radical left government locked arms with the United States to expand Suda Bay and negotiated an end to the North Macedonian name controversy. And the center-right government that followed has impressed Washington with its pro-growth economic stewardship and steadfast support for NATO in helping in the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, it is the United States that experienced a violent attempt to overthrow a national election and is entering midterm elections with many candidates who still deny the validity of the 2020 results. So the question I hear from Greeks when I come over is, what the heck is going on in the United States? I'm not sure I or anyone can fully answer that question. It's a very strange time. But what I can do today, as Joan says, is to give you a sense of the political and policy landscape in Washington right now, how it might play out over the next 2 or 3 years, and how all that might affect the physical and financial security of Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean. While the threats to democracy and the rule of law in the United States are serious, they are also increasingly well understood by government officials, corporate and philanthropic leaders, and by a growing percentage of the voters themselves. I think in my experience, it is the threats you don't expect, like the attacks on 9/11, that are the most dangerous. And while the political situation is alarming, the American democratic system retains, is full of redundancies and checks and balances that make it hard to fully subvert. To give you just one example, the former president recently lost a court battle over highly classified documents he illegally took from the White House because of the decision by a 3-judge panel, 2 of whom Trump himself put on the bench. Over the last couple of 100 years in America, the party in power has almost always lost dozens of congressional seats in the midterm elections. Just a few months ago, opinion polls indicated that the 2022 midterms would follow that historic pattern, with Republicans easily winning back control of both houses. But something happened this summer to change the dynamics. Both parties delivered on their promises. The Democrats passed sweeping measures to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure, clean energy, and microchip manufacturing, while the price of gasoline dropped for 3 straight months. The Republican Party also delivered via a conservative Supreme Court on its long-term promise to take away the right of a woman to have an abortion. Turns out the voters were impressed with the Democrats' accomplishments and repulsed by the Republicans. So today, opinion polls suggest Democrats will hold the Senate and have about a 30% chance of retaining the House also. Of course, anything can happen in elections, but let's presume, as the polls suggest that Republicans take the House and Democrats hold the Senate. What might that mean for the biggest policy areas that affect Greece and Cyprus and the Eastern Mediterranean? One thing that won't change is support for Greece and Cyprus in Congress. Senator Bob Menendez, Greece's best friend in the Senate, will continue to chair the Foreign Relations Committee. Democratic Greek Americans in the House, like John Sarbanes and Dina Titus, will be in the minority, but Republican Greek Americans, like Gus Bilirakis and Nicole Maliotakis, will be in the majority. Another thing that won't change is support for a harder line against China. Neither party is going back to the days when the emerging Chinese market looked like the key to U.S. prosperity, and accommodating China on its economic and political demands was seen as leading to that country's liberalization. Support for the war in Ukraine will continue also, but with caveats. Republicans will use control of the House to raise questions about U.S. aid to Ukraine, especially the disparity between that and European aid levels. But they are unlikely to have any serious impact on the administration's Ukraine policy until a year from now during budget season. That means President Biden will have a relatively free hand to continue his strategy in Ukraine, one that, while not without flaws, has proven more effective than almost anyone predicted. The stakes obviously couldn't be higher. Much of the world rightly sees this conflict as a test of the relative powers of liberal democracy and nationalist authoritarianism. But it is also a test of whether a core tenet of the UN Charter, the right of nations not to be invaded, will be defended. If Vladimir Putin continues to lose in Ukraine, China will have more reason to doubt the wisdom of military action against Taiwan, and Turkey will be less likely to do something stupid in the Aegean. For many decades, Republicans, taking their cue from the Pentagon, were generally more willing to support Turkey than Democrats, for whom human rights weighed heavier. Today, there's unprecedented frustration and skepticism with and about Turkey at the highest levels of the military, in the writings of conservative defense intellectuals, and among GOP lawmakers. And Republicans, as well as Democrats, are increasingly aware of Greece's relative stability, fidelity to NATO, and deepening relationships with the U.S. and Israel. All of this is obviously a positive development for the security of Greece, Cyprus, and the region, but it also has positive implications in the economic realm, particularly in energy. Both parties in the U.S. now strongly prefer to see Greece, rather than Turkey, become the interconnector of North African, Middle East, and Eastern Mediterranean energy, gas and electricity. There are two ways the Biden administration can help make that a reality. First, diplomatically, by making its preference clear to Greece's allies and to large energy and investment firms. Fortunately for Greece, the diplomat who will be in charge of energy policy, the new Assistant Secretary of State for Energy, is the former U.S. Ambassador, Jeffrey Pyatt. I'm sure many of you know him. The second way the administration can help is through decisions it will be making over the rules and deployment of $370 billion in alternative energy investments it recently secured in the landmark Inflation Reduction Act and in a follow-on piece of legislation that is expected to pass, championed by Senator Joe Manchin, on regulatory relief for pipelines and other forms of transmission. The person in the White House who will be managing all this is none other than John Podesta, my old boss and a Greek American who is fully aware of the Eastern Mediterranean situation. Another area of emerging thinking in the Biden administration that could have positive consequences for Greece is trade policy, where the Biden administration is attempting something new. It is neither the neoliberal approach of trying to break down regulatory barriers to advance the interests of large corporations. nor the Trump administration's nationalistic bludgeoning of Europe with tariffs, neither of which led to lasting agreements in Europe. Instead, the Biden administration is attempting to negotiate with the EU agreements on discrete areas, such as carbon content, supply chain security, antitrust, privacy, data security, technology transfer, and so on, while sidestepping the more contentious issues like agriculture. No more spats over American chlorinated chickens. You're already seeing progress on this agenda in the resolution of the Boeing-Airbus trade dispute after 17 years, and the signing of the US-EU agreement on aluminum and steel that's attempting to craft new metrics on the use of carbon in the making of these metals. The aim of the administration is not just economic, but geostrategic. It is to raise the middle and working class wages on both sides of the Atlantic, the better to undercut domestic support for illiberal politics, and to create standards that challenge the economic predations of Russia and China. In the future, there's also likely to be a Marshall Plan type effort to rebuild Ukraine. Given Greece's geopolitical location, its energy and transportation infrastructure, the relative sophistication of its financial institutions, and the fact that it has a substantial diaspora in Ukraine, I would be surprised if the United States doesn't encourage Greece to play an outsized role in that rebuilding effort, just as President Clinton did of Greece in the Balkans when he spoke here in 1999. In these and other ways, the situation in Washington is one that can be advantageous for Greece and also for Cyprus, as we've just seen with the lifting of the U.S. arms embargo on that country. No one can know what the political future of the United States will be, but for now, it has a president more committed to the transatlantic relationship than any since Bill Clinton, and maybe even since Eisenhower. There is plenty in the world to worry about, and we'll be doing a lot of worrying today, but this is one thing that we can be thankful for. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. We've got very limited time, given we're overrunning for questions. If somebody has some really urgent question about the US, please stick your hand up. Otherwise, I'm just going to ask a few quick fire questions. I mean, everything that you've said is all very positive from the perspective of Greece. And more generally also, in terms of a reset in US-EU relations. Is there any concern in the US that Western unity might begin to fray when the going gets tough in Europe this winter?
No question. I mean, I think policymakers, I'm not sure the American public is quite aware, but policymakers are very aware of the very tough winter Europe is about to enter. I'm sure that there are discussions about what the United States can do about that. Frankly, it's limited. Would be great if we had LNG ports that are on the books but not built that could help with the energy problems. There's open questioning in newspapers about, how long, war fatigue and so forth. I think it's a real issue, and but the sense of toughing it out and being serious about this from the Biden administration is very clear. They've not wavered, so we shall see.
And despite what you said about some of the questions that we are already seeing and that we might expect more of in future from the Republican side about the funding of Ukraine and the fact that the US is playing this outsized role, and there does seem to be, from this side of the Atlantic, seems to be a very strong, really bipartisan consensus on the war in Ukraine. Or is that an exaggeration? And might it change maybe in 2024 if the Republicans were to come back? And
it's hard to say. I mean, I've given up trying to predict where the Republican Party is going. It seems to plumb deeper and deeper depths of conspiracy and so forth. But, you know, the American public is with this war. There are Ukrainian flags on lawns next to Trump flags in parts of rural America. You know, there's great sympathy for the Ukrainians. There's a general sense that the stakes are high. You know, the Biden administration has made very clear Americans are not going to serve in Ukraine. You know, were there American deaths, that would be a very different thing. But there's no love lost for Vladimir Putin. And the earlier support for Putin that you saw among some Republicans, they've all sort of backed off on that. So we shall see. But right now, it's quite unified support.
And maybe if I just push you a little bit on this, what is obviously the US is not at war with Russia, although some people would argue that it is pursuing a proxy war, not to deny the agency of the Ukrainians, but nevertheless that the US may have its own policy objectives here that might be slightly different from others in Europe. So what is the aim? Is the aim just about defending Ukraine, or is it also about containing, weakening, humiliating, defeating Russia, and even achieving regime change? And what does that, and if that is the case, and if you implied that the objective may be to send a message to China and others, maybe Turkey too, is that alignment with European policy going to last further as the war goes on?
I think if you talk to Democratic operatives, they'll say, why isn't Joe Biden taking more credit for the success of the war so far? And the answer is Joe Biden knows he's a member of, the United States is a member of NATO, and that without European support for this war, the war becomes much less successful from the Western point of view. He's really, obviously, the leader of the European NATO alliance, but I think their aim is to keep the alliance together and to prosecute the war to the maximum extent that can be done with the alliance together. And you know, Ukraine is not in the alliance. It is the security of Europe and the United States and the rule of law, rather than any one particular objective that I think is foremost in their minds.
Okay, thanks. From what you said, you also seem to imply that US institutions in general and the military in particular is becoming increasingly frustrated with Turkey, no longer seen as maybe a reliable partner, NATO member. Is that manifesting itself in unexpected ways? Because I think a great effort was made for a very long time by the US to keep Turkey on side. So do you think things have fundamentally changed in that regard?
I do. I've been semi-involved in this issue for a long time, and I really do think that some of the most vocal and hawkish Republicans like Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio are just fed up, and just the selling of the missiles system to Turkey really was a bridge too far for them. And it will take some doing on the part of the Turks to win back the former level of support that they had.
Thanks. Just a final question. What you said about a geostrategic focus that's really becoming more prominent in the policy of the Biden administration. I mean, it's been also called, I think Janet Yellen said, friend-shoring as well. So combining of a geopolitical commitment, a commitment to democratic allies with a kind of geo-economic focus. So which, Greece could well be a major beneficiary of this. Which is all good news to hear. But at the same time, we have AUKUS and this big shift and focus to Asia and the Indo-Pacific, and this now military alliance of the US and UK and Australia with a nuclear component and so on, which suggests actually that in the future Europe becomes less important for the US. So has the war in Ukraine changed that kind of
I think so. Look, obviously Asia is rising. The future of the world economy is going to be driven much more so by Asia than the developed world, right? There's just more growth potential there. But the Biden administration is attempting the same sort of trade focus in Asia as it is with the Europeans. I think that what makes the effort with the Europeans, and again, this is latent, this is something that's emerging, it's not a full-blown strategy yet. The Washington Monthly has been writing that it should be a full-blown strategy for some years. General Wesley Clark, among others, has written for us on that. But what Europe provides is a partner in values. Europeans and the United States share a lot of the same values of personal freedoms, of privacy, of anti-corruption and so forth. And it's easier to make these agreements with countries that basically agree with you. And together, the EU and the US make up, with the UK, 45% of global GDP. So you can imagine a set of agreements, if not a total trade pact, that creates a market into which others want to sell. And so the standards that the US and the EU develop become the standards that the rest of the world have to abide by if they want to sell into that market. It's a very powerful tool.
Well, thank you, Paul. I think we have to leave it there, unfortunately. There's so much more we could discuss, but really thanks very much for joining us. I hope you can stay on. I'm sure a lot of people here will want to ask you some more
I'd be delighted to talk. I love to talk.
In the US. So, but we have to leave it here now and move on to the next session. But,
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.